I'm Jamie from ESL Teacher 365, and I sat down with Christopher Walker, an English teacher and author, to learn what it's like to teach abroad in Poland. He's been teaching there for over a decade and has a lot of advice and knowledge to share. Thanks so much, Chris, for coming on my channel today. We would love to know how you got started teaching abroad and where you are currently teaching abroad.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Jamie. I'm really excited to be here. I've seen your videos and they're really good. It's great that you're giving teachers the chance to speak for themselves. You know, I've just come back home after 6 hours of teaching and 6 hours of being in classrooms with people and never talking about yourself. It's emotionally a bit draining. So this is quite the opportunity for me. My story with teaching English as a foreign language actually now stretches back 20 years, believe it or not. I had a very brief dalliance with teaching in Japan with one of the big three companies as they were back then. And I only lasted 6 months because I was rubbish, frankly. At that stage, I hadn't done the CELTA. I had no experience of the classroom. And I decided to quit fairly early on after some of my students complained about the lessons. And I went out of teaching for quite some time. But there was always this kind of nagging feeling in the back of my head saying, maybe I should have tried it again and I could do a better job. So I enrolled on the CELTA in 2006. Was offered a job at International House Krakow, as it was back then, where I did the CELTA. I worked there for a year. Then after a very brief break, I wanted to see what it was like to be a student again. So I went to Spain to study Spanish, to see what the teaching was like there. I then got a job here in Bielsko-Biała. As you can see behind me, this is the Sulkowski Castle in
Lovely.
Bielsko. That's a virtual background, just in case anyone's wondering. Uh, and I've been here pretty much ever since.
How was the CELTA course for you? Because I know some people are curious. Did you do the full-time course, the part-time course? How did you like the CELTA?
Oh, I did the full-time course. So it was 4 weeks, and I don't think there was the option of the Young Learners Extension, but I
Mhm.
have since done that. I've done the certificate in teaching young learners and teens, and I think it's really useful. Not least because the CELTA is great for kind of general English for teaching the ideal or idealized student.
Yes.
But that's not who you're going to be teaching on day
No.
one. You go into the classroom and it's a group of 8 or 9-year-olds, and you think, okay, now how am I actually going to teach these people who don't have like world experience and things like that to draw on, and who have perhaps not exactly behavioral issues, but they certainly need to learn how to behave. And the CELTA doesn't do very much on that sort of thing, the classroom management. It's more like you've got a group of 10 students and they are all perfectly motivated and perfectly well behaved. Now deliver English to them. And then you realize pretty quickly that that's not it. But definitely doing the CELTA is essential. If not the CELTA, at least some sort of initial training. And I like the idea of it being fairly intensive so that you're under pressure, because you're going to be under pressure every day of your teaching career, aren't you?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
but doing it with other people as well makes a difference, because whilst I'm under pressure every day in my job, I tend to work in the staff room before the lessons and there are other teachers there and we bounce ideas back and forth. You know, it's not that we are in a vacuum. There are other people out there who can help us. So this that goes with the CELTA, that goes as well with day-to-day teaching. So I think it is a really good experience that way.
I really enjoyed it because, yes, teaching kids and teaching adults are two completely different things, like you mentioned, in terms of classroom management, but even just learner motivation and things like that. So, yeah, I think the CELTA is a very good course to do. I did the part-time one while I was teaching, so it was a bit of a different experience. So, yeah, there's the full-time one is I've heard, I didn't do it, but it's quite intense. What different ages have you taught and what different levels have you taught?
My goodness, in the time that I've been here at this school, I don't think that there's an age or level I haven't taught. I've been called in to teach everybody going, um, because although, you know, I express a preference for certain classes, and at this stage of my career, in other words, because I'm getting on a little bit, I prefer to let younger teachers deal with the kids. I just don't have the energy these days.
Yeah, it's a lot of energy.
It is. But we do have a standby system. So the idea is that you've got your timetable, but there will be little gaps here and there in case somebody is ill. So today, for instance, I covered for a fellow teacher. So I taught a class that was relatively unfamiliar, slightly younger than most of the students I teach. But there's a lot of support given by the school. So if you ever have a problem teaching a particular class, they will help. I think the youngest that I've had to teach, and that was only on a kind of standby basis, was 6, 7 years old. At the higher end, we do get older students as well, people who want English either for career purposes or because they travel abroad quite often. So I've had students certainly into their 60s, even into their 70s.
How did you get a visa for Poland? Obviously, it's a bit different now after Brexit, but when it was,
Yes.
yes, a while ago, how was that process and how would it be now?
I had a conversation with one of my colleagues at work today. So she enlightened me on the process now.
Excellent.
When I came to Poland, the process was simple. I came to Poland.
Yes.
That was it, really. Freedom of movement within the EU, it was such a treasure. And I think people have no idea, the general public have no idea what a treasure it is that we've thrown away. I came to Poland. I didn't need to do any paperwork at all. I came in, I did my CELTA. I joined the school. They registered me in the relevant offices. The secretarial staff took me to file the paperwork, but it was just, rubber stamped. It was all fine. When I came to Bielsko and I settled here, eventually I married. As I mentioned, I have children here. I'm self-employed within my school as a kind of contractor of sorts. So I have now a business history here, as well as other ties, property, that sort of thing. So through that, I've been able to get permanent residence, which is very useful to me because it's like being an EU citizen, but slightly
Yeah.
less.
Yep.
So I don't have to worry when I travel around the EU. So I had a conversation then with one of my colleagues to discuss what it was like in their situation, and everything has changed. So first of all, you apply for a work permit. Now you can do that anywhere because it's usually the employer that applies, or you apply through the employer. And if that work permit is granted, you then have 90 days in which to apply for a temporary residence visa. So you need to get that visa. But the visa has to be applied for outside of Poland.
Yeah.
So the teacher I was talking to will be flying back home to England for the Christmas period so that they can sort that out. Once they've made the application, they're kind of okay. It can just sit in the system, and it can sit in the system for up to a year or a year and a half. But as long as you've got the application in process, you're okay to continue working. But where it gets tricky is that once it's in the system, you can't leave the country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you leave the country, it stops. You have to go through the whole process again. So it has caused some real consternation. I mean, it's like getting the work permit approved at the 11th hour. I know teachers who have, because of the uncertainty, they've just decided to go outside of the EU to teach,
Yeah.
even though they had a solid job offer here. Others took the risk, but it's such a risk because if you don't know if you can work in a place, and you get a backup offer, you then have a decision to make. You either take the risk of staying and the paperwork going through, or you say, okay, I'll just go for the offer that is concrete and where I know where I stand. And from what I gather, it's a similar position for most British people looking for work elsewhere in the EU.
Yeah, and I think that it's been like this for Americans and other
It
nationalities
has.
non-EU for a long time.
Yes.
But
Yes.
for British people, maybe they're not aware of all of these changes because, like you mentioned, before it was so easy to
That's
work
true.
as a
Yeah.
teacher, but now not
Yeah.
so
And
much.
there's even a little bit of uncertainty on the Polish side. So
Hmm.
depending on where you are, the application process might be a lot smoother. So I've
Hmm.
heard stories of people in, for example, Torun, which is a lovely city in the north of the country, where the whole process was done in about a month. But for people down in Bielsko, which is kind of off the tourist track a little bit, where they're not so used to dealing with this sort of application,
Right.
it rolled on and rolled on and rolled on.
What would you say to someone who is thinking about going through this process, but maybe they're a bit put off by all the paperwork? Would you say that it's worth it? Would you say to look in other places?
I would say it very much depends on the person's attitude to teaching as a career.
Hmm.
And I think one of the big changes, certainly in my experience and as in my career, is that more and more people are attracted to EFL because of the teaching side and a
Hmm.
little bit less because of the backpacking, traveling side,
Right.
because it is a serious business. I think gone are the days where you could just walk into a job because you are a native speaker and therefore in demand. People want quality education now. They don't just want to be in a cafe chatting to somebody who sounds nice.
Yeah.
So I think if it's somebody who's still kind of toying with the idea, who's not completely certain if they want to go into it properly, maybe looking outside where the process is a little bit simpler and smoother, maybe that would make sense. But there are definite advantages to going through all the hassle, as I can see, because I know teachers who are going through all that hassle.
Yeah.
And that's that, for example, here in Poland, it's really one of the best countries I can think of to get started on that career. The students themselves generally are very nice. The schools generally are good. There's a big kind of there's a lot of importance put on the idea of professional development, which is so useful in your early career. You don't
Yeah.
want to just there's the old saying that there are two kinds of teachers who have been working for 10 years. There's one who's been working for 10 years and growing, and the other one who's taught 1 year 10 times.
Yeah.
So if you come to Poland, I think you'd be more of the former because you are developing, you're building your skill set, you're seeing what it's like with different students in different arrangements. So if you're actually thinking of making a career for yourself out of EFL, English as a foreign language teaching, Poland is a great place to start. You do need to get over the bureaucratic problem, but I think it probably is worth it.
Let's talk about culture shock. So, when you first arrived in Poland, did you experience culture shock?
Can't say that I've experienced very much culture shock. Some things have been curious
Okay.
or unusual. Some things are very interesting to note. So, for example, I still remember quite clearly being picked up at the airport before doing my CELTA, because I had one of those bundle things where you get the CELTA and the accommodation all wrapped up in one,
Mhm.
which was great because I didn't have to worry about all of that. And it included pickup at the airport. And it was late in the evening, so it was dark out. And I was taken over into the center of Krakow down one of these side streets. And the guy led me inside this building that for a moment I thought was derelict. Like the entry hall was just, it was horrible, like peeling plaster, no recent paintwork or anything like that. And I thought, oh my goodness, what have I let myself in for? But then he opened the door to the apartment itself, and I went in, and it was gorgeous. It was lovely. And later I found out that generally the shared spaces in a lot of apartment blocks are not really looked after so much. And it's almost like a kind of like a knock-on effect of communism.
Mhm.
Communism, everything belonged to everybody. After communism, you could have your own thing. But if you could have your own thing, it meant the things that were for everyone you didn't care about so much. So I know it doesn't really count much as culture shock, but it is worth bearing in mind that if you go into a space like I don't know, the vestibule or entryway of an apartment block, and you look around and think, well, I bet the apartments here really, really aren't nice. You'll
Yeah.
find that they are. So that was quite nice. A lot of people say that Polish people tend to be a little bit cold, which has a certain degree of truth to it. You don't always get a smile when you go into a shop, but then that's the way it is. We can't go into different places and apply our own sensibilities to
Yeah.
the people working there.
And it's interesting what you say about the housing as well. I experienced that in Egypt too. So the place where I was, yeah, walking down the street, like it didn't look like the greatest, but my actual apartment was a palace, like massive rooms, and it was just gorgeous. But yeah, same kind of thing where the culture really affects the housing. So they
Hmm.
kind of keep all of their treasures hidden. And yeah, if you're not, I guess, expecting that or used to that, it can be, like you said, a little bit curious, not so much shocking, but Just quite interesting. So let's talk about some negatives. So, what are some negative things about teaching in Poland?
Well, the first negative that I want to mention can actually work as a positive if you have the right frame of mind.
I like that.
Now, when I was working in the UK, I was employed by whoever I was working for, which meant that when I was making national insurance contributions for welfare and health and everything like that, my employer was as well. But that came at a cost to them. Now, a lot of places in Poland operate on such fine margins that they look for savings wherever they can. And one area that they can save is by asking their teachers, they don't demand, but a lot of places ask that their teachers consider becoming self employed. So
Okay.
that involves opening your own company, finding an accountant, and paying your own tax and national insurance contributions every month. They come to quite a lot, unfortunately. So there is a slight issue there. However, the silver lining to that is that if you have your own company, you can start taking on work from other clients who demand an invoice. Not everybody wants to operate cash in hand, and really we shouldn't be, because that's
Mm.
kind of a bit of a gray area. So, for example, I've made contact with a lot of people in local universities. When they're preparing a paper for an academic journal, they tend to send it to me. They ask me to proofread it, which I've grown reasonably good at, I think, and I produce an invoice for the work, which I then send to my accountant. Now, if I didn't have my own company, I couldn't really take on that kind of work. So it's been a long time since I last prepared an invoice only for International House and not for other people as well. On balance, it really works for me. The biggest negative that I can think of for teaching generally is that the salaries are not enormous. They're good to be comfortable on, like, month to month, but we have to remember that we're only really employed for 3 quarters of the year. I have a contract that runs from the first week of October to about the first or second week of June. So that leaves all of July, August, and September where I'm effectively unemployed. And likewise, if you've got your own company, you won't be paid for anything that you can't invoice for, which means that Christmas break you can't invoice for, the winter break, likewise, Easter, likewise, every public holiday. It's not a day off, it's a single day of unemployment. And over the course of the year, they add up as well. I think if you can get past that, I mean, people keep talking about how easy it is for teachers because we have such a long holiday.
Ooh.
It's not a holiday if you're not being paid during that time.
No.
But if you can find a way to kind of operate in that system, then it can balance out.
What advice do you have for teaching abroad in general?
We're always told to be patient with our students because learning takes a long time. If a
Mhm.
student is exposed to a new piece of language, we can't expect them to just get it. They need a lot of practice. They need to come back to that language again and again and again. As teachers, I think we all accept that and we all understand it. So it's quite curious to see teachers not giving themselves that time. They come into a new situation, they're teaching classes that aren't familiar, and then they become very kind of downbeat or depressed if things aren't going well a month into the course. Well, of course they're not. It's all a new experience. They might not be going well now, though, but if you stick with it and if you get the support you need and you ask for that support, it will get better in that year. And if you can get through your first year into your second, the whole landscape changes. You come back, you find that things start going better. The things that you thought were really difficult the first year are no longer quite as much of a challenge. You can start thinking, okay, well, now that I seem to have this kind of teaching about right in my life, I could maybe start developing. Maybe I could do a course and learn a specialism or something like that. Maybe I could take on more responsibility. You need to give yourself the time in which to develop, though. We can't just say, okay, well, I just attended a conference talk or I saw a webinar about teaching young learners. So from tomorrow, my young learners classes will be perfect. It doesn't work like that. It is a very gradual process. And I think it is worth bearing that in mind so we don't get too disappointed when things don't go the way that they should.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think that you learn so much, like we talked about before, from your colleagues, from your coworkers, just bouncing off ideas, but also if you're able to doing observations as a new teacher, if you're allowed to at your school, ask to sit in on some of the classes of the teachers who have been there for a very long time. You'll pick up a lot of different classroom behavior, management strategies, teaching strategies, and I think that can be really, really helpful to learn on the job because, of course, doing a course is just very, very short and you don't have a lot of time where you can actually put into practice what you've learned. So, yeah, it's very important to be in a supportive school, and that definitely helps you stay motivated. And if you're in a situation where you aren't feeling that support, then you need to find a different school because it's just probably going to be pretty miserable for you. Tell us a bit about your book.
Thank you. Yes. So I've been teaching for a long time, and I haven't always been that serious about progressing my own understanding of things, especially when it comes to grammar. I was always very reliant on the grammar guide in the
Hmm.
books and going through the different lessons as they were presented. But that's not always worked well for me. So, for example, a number of years ago, I was teaching a class of adults at like B1, B2 level, and they were having a hard time accepting the idea of the present simple for future meaning.
Ah,
They were
yes.
like, no, present simple, it's present simple. Can't be
Yeah.
for the future. They just they were really panicking. And then I said, well, yeah, but as a narrative tense, we can even use present forms to talk about the past. One guy didn't come back after that lesson. He'd had enough. That was it. So I was encouraged by my then director of studies, a woman called Kasia Yakilashek, to go back into studying. We did the what was it, language awareness course, written by Alex Tilbury, who's a teacher, I think, in Wrocław and Warsaw these days. And from then, I kind of had this desire to really understand grammar and how it really works. Several years later, I finally got round to putting it all together in the book you can see just here, which I've called English is a Simple Language. Now, we both know that's not entirely true, but the idea is actually based on the quote by Bill Shankly, a football manager, who once said that football is a simple game. And
Mhm.
he explained what he meant by it, and that's basically the idea here. So instead of just going through the grammar that is presented in the course book and just blindly saying, okay, yes, this is future simple because it's will plus whatever,
Yeah.
I tied up a lot of the things that I'd read about in Michael Lewis. The English Verb is a classic that all teachers should read. I tied a lot of that together with what Alex Tilbury said and a lot of my own ideas, some of which might not be right, who knows. And yeah, this is the result. It's on Amazon either as a Kindle edition or as the paperback that you can see here. And the feedback I've had so far has been positive. Some of the teachers I work with were kind enough to even buy their own copy instead of asking me to just give it to them, which really impressed me. And they've used it a bit. They said that they looked at a particular chapter, then used the principles in their lesson, and it seemed to smooth the way, certainly for them, if not for their students. So I'm glad that I wrote it, but it is important to point out that other people got me started there, and other
Mhm.
people provided a lot of the ideas that the book builds from.
Thanks so much, Chris, for coming on my channel today. And I will link Chris's book down below and where you can find him online. So if you're curious about teaching in Poland or teaching abroad in general, if you have any questions, just leave them down in the comments. And if you'd like any future videos for other countries, you can leave that in the comments below as well. So thanks again, Chris, for coming on the channel.
Thank you very much for having me, Jamie. I shall like and subscribe.